so you can watch it with your friends. We will send a follow-up email to everyone who registered with links to books, articles, or other resources that Donnetta references in her talk so you can learn more. Please keep an eye out for that email. In that email, there will also be a link to a very short survey. We'd like to know how you found us and hear your suggestions for how we can improve. Thank you in advance for filling that out. So, now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce tonight's speaker. Donnetta Bishop Johnson became the executive director of the Stoutsburg Sourland African American Museum in October of 2021. She is a community leader and Hillsborough business owner who began her career as a pioneering Black woman in technology, working as a programmer and senior project manager at AT&T. Donnetta left her corporate career to pursue her passion for entrepreneurship as the founder of the Allegra School of Music and Arts in 1999. She is also the founder of the Hillsborough Music Festival, which promotes local businesses in partnership with government and the arts in support of youth mental health and suicide prevention. The stories and histories of people of the African diaspora have always been of great importance to her, and she is excited to join the grassroots and professional historians at SAM to share and celebrate rich history and promising future. Thank you, Donnetta. Take it away.
Thank you, Lori Cleveland. Hello, everyone. Good evening. I'm so happy to be here. I'm so happy to present this information, which I've had a very interesting time researching and being fascinated and horrified by at the same time. So I'm so appreciative that you all have come out this evening to hear this information. So the land upon which we gather is part of the traditional, next slide please. It's part of the traditional territory of the Lenape, the Lenni Lenape, called the Lenape-Hoking. The Lenape people lived in harmony with one another upon this territory for thousands of years. During the colonial era and the early federal period, many were removed west and north, but also some remained. At SAM, we acknowledge the Lenni Lenape as the original people of this land and their continuing relationship with the territory. So SAM has a land acknowledgement, which I'd love to read to you. The Lenape have a saying, "We do not own the land, we are of the land, we belong to it." It is with deep respect, appreciation, and humility that we at the Stoutsburg Sourland African American Museum honor the legacy of the original inhabitants, storytellers, and land caretakers of this region. By honoring our shared and uniquely American past, we aim to disrupt the erasure of Indigenous people, African American people, and other disenfranchised communities to bring forward a truthful history of the Sourland region. We do this out of respect for the removed and erased Indigenous people and their traditions and the ongoing struggles of Black and Brown people today. Thank you. Next slide. So, here's the question of this evening. Why are African Americans not so involved in environmental causes? So first of all, I need for you all to realize that this premise is false. And secondly, the answer is very complicated. Many Americans still do not associate Black people with environmental causes. But this idea of African Americans existing apart from nature and natural environments ignores crucial aspects of the African American experience within our shared American history. Next slide. So, where do we start? We have to start at the beginning. For most of American history, land was used as a bludgeon against the bodies of Black people who were forced to work the land while being deprived of the huge amount of wealth that their labor created and the value of their own bodies and lives. So I need to address the founding myth about the slave trade. It's widely believed, and this is what I was taught, that Africans were randomly captured and they didn't have any skills. They just came with their strong bodies. So this is not true. They brought with them a lots of skills. They were skilled at rice cultivation and a wide variety of crop production. They were weavers, textile makers, wood and stone masonry workers. They had a long, long history with horses and animal husbandry. They, of course, had resistance to tropical diseases, most notably malaria. Many captured West Africans were trained soldiers with knowledge of military hierarchy and military discipline. Next slide. Did you know, because I didn't know up until about 6 years ago, that slavery existed in all of the colonies? Raise your hand if you knew that. How long have you known that? 10 years, 20 years, 30 years? Back when you were in school? Did you learn that in school? Okay. I didn't understand that until about 10 years ago. Many people don't know that there was ever slavery in New Jersey or how important it was to the state's economy and development. Slavery was taught to me as a Southern institution, but it was a part of life of every British North American colony before the American Revolution, including New Jersey. New Jersey became a colony in 1664. That year, the first governing document of the colony granted white English settlers at least 60 acres of free land for every enslaved person that they owned. The more enslaved people, the more land. This meant that slavery was not only legal, it was actively encouraged and promoted from the very beginning. The policies and laws of the colonies were designed to spread slavery and make it stronger. Enslaved people were sold all across the colony, and by the end of the 18th century, New Jersey's enslaved population was one of the largest in the Northeast. On the eve of the American Revolution, more than 8,200 enslaved people lived and labored in New Jersey, second only to New York among the northern states. New Jersey's enslaved population actually grew after the Revolution. By 1800s, when other northern states were passing anti-slavery laws, more than 12,400 enslaved people lived in New Jersey. I heard a separate statistic that said New Jersey had more enslaved African American men than non-land-owning white men. All right, and that doesn't even include the women and children. So I'm going to repeat that. New Jersey had more enslaved men than non-land-owning white men. Pretty astounding. In Bergen and Monmouth County, the number of enslaved people doubled between 1772 and 1800. So this goes against the narrative that we often hear that during the Revolution, the ideals of liberty and equality led to the reduction of slavery in the North. Not what happened in New Jersey. Next slide. So New Jersey is known as the Garden State. So when I arrived here in 1986, I thought that meant that many people had lovely gardens. In fact, agriculture is a billion-dollar industry and the state's third largest industry. Next slide. But I bet you didn't know that the Garden State was once known as the slave state of the North. Enslaved people worked on plantations because there were indeed plantations in New Jersey. You know that? Raise your hand if you've ever conceived of plantations in New Jersey. A plantation is generally defined as a farm with 20 or more enslaved laborers, and those certainly existed in the state, although they grew different crops than in the South. So whereas in the South, large plantations, they grew tobacco and cotton and rice. In New Jersey, it was wheat and a host of other crops. This is something that I didn't realize, that New Jersey's fertile, temperate climate and rich soil encouraged a high demand for enslaved labor to produce grains, fruit, and vegetables on a large scale. And New Jersey wasn't just participating in local agriculture. Our produce supplied the large markets of New York and Philadelphia and the Caribbean as part of the colonial system that relied on using enslaved labor as a vast creator of wealth for the British Empire and later for the newly formed United States. Next slide. So here's a typical ad for an enslaved woman in New Jersey. To be sold, a young Negro woman, about 20 years old. She does all sorts of housework. She can brew, bake, boil, roast, soap, wash, iron, and starch, and is a good dairy woman, and she can card and spin at the will. Cotton, linen, woolen. She has another good property. She neither drinks rum or smokes tobacco. And she is strong and healthy wench. She's a strong and healthy wench. It's difficult to read the Dutch. She can cook pretty well, or roast and boil. She can speak no other language but English, and she has had smallpox in Barbados as a child. So this is an ad from New Jersey in about 1734. The labor of enslaved females is really, I think, captured in this ad. So next slide. You're already there. All right, very good. So what types of other work did enslaved people do here? The answer is everything. Beyond the numbers, enslaved men and women, and yes, children, were recognized as being quite skilled at their task. Black labor was employed in agriculture, as we know, mining, iron making, construction, quarries, land and sea transportation, log hauling, and craft. These human beings were considered a fantastic investment. They were considered to be jacks of all trade in the house and in the field. New Jersey farmers concentrated on growing wheat, corn, rye, as well as keeping orchards and meadowlands. In Dutch communities, enslaved people herded cattle, pigs, horses. Other tasks included barrel making, carding, shoemaking, preparing meats, poultry, and fish for cooking. It goes on. Other skills included carpentry, blacksmithing, coppering, tanning, leatherworking, crop, livestock care, carriage driving, on and on and on and on. All right, so there was a gentleman, a man who had an enslaved person, Yumble, who was a master leather worker who was born around 1750 in Africa, and he was purchased by Aaron Mellick in Somerset County because he was a most valuable workman. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about African Americans and land ownership, because land ownership is really important in America, as it probably is in a lot of the world. It leads to a stake in the community. It leads to stability. It's the American dream, and it leads to generational wealth. So by 1713, an act for regulating slaves prohibited free blacks and indigenous people from holding real estate, which meant they could not possess any house or land in New Jersey. This opportunity of land ownership as a stability and wealth vehicle was restricted to people of European descent. So in their book, If These Stones Can Talk, Elaine and Beverly talk about before paper currency was backed by gold and silver in New Jersey. It was supported by land bank mortgages. Land ownership was the pathway to wealth, power, and influence in New Jersey. Next slide, please. Still, people found a way. With the repeal in 1798 of the land ownership prohibition, free blacks seized the opportunity, but were redlined into the least desirable land opportunities, and then could typically only purchase land through a pre-existing relationship with a white landowner. Again, in their book, If These Stones Could Talk, STEM founders Elaine and Beverly asked questions regarding the founding African-American families and landowners in the Sourland Mountain. So they asked, how did blacks become landowners in this notoriously sour land? Was it because the harsh conditions of the soil created opportunities for black land ownership in the Sourland Mountain region, meaning no one else wanted the land? It was too dangerous, it was too rocky, it was too difficult to be there? Were they willing to take on any challenge to gain access to agency, autonomy, and access to the American dream? The answer is yes, yes, and yes. Again, since laws and discriminatory deed covenants, yes, there were deed restrictions disallowing the sale of property to blacks. Some of these deeds are still on the books. So these restrictions made it difficult for black people to hold and own property. Blacks could typically only purchase through a pre-existing relationship, like I said, with landowners. So there was a New Jersey landowner, Nathaniel Crane. His will freed his enslaved person, James Howe, and bequeathed to him the house and 5 acres. Also specified that the property would pass on to Howe's heirs. Okay, Crane's thorough language protected Howe against covenants and schemes that often deprived black people of the ability to pass down or inherit property. So I think that's something to really hold on. If you manage to get land, couldn't necessarily pass it on and create the generational wealth that white folks take for granted. You know, every generation had to start from scratch. So, yet there were African American landowners on the Sourland Mountain, and they include folks like Tom Blue, Billy Truehard, who's Bridie Truehard's grandson, and also an ancestor of Beverly Mills, William Stives, and the Haberman family. Billy Truehard is quoted as saying in an article, to some people, their native home means everything, more important than all the money in the world. So this was an African-American article, Afro-American article. And more about him later. Next slide. So regarding the larger American landscape, land was an ideological priority for black families after the Civil War, when nearly 4 million people were freed from slavery. On January 12th, look at the first bullet, referring to 40 acres and a mule. On January 12th, 1865, just before emancipation, the Union Army General William Sherman met with 20 black ministers in Savannah, Georgia, and asked them what they needed. They responded, the way we can best take care of ourselves is land. Their spokesperson, the Reverend Garrison Fraser, told Sherman, the land would place us where we could recap the fruit of our own labor. So Sherman issued a special field order declaring that 400,000 acres formerly held by Confederates would be given to African Americans. And this was what became known as the Promise of 40 Acres Mule. How do you think that worked out? The newly established Freedmen Bureau was never able to control enough land to fulfill this promise. If you look at bullet number 2, the following year in 1866, Congress passed the Southern Homestead Act, opening up 46 million acres of public land that had been taken from Native Americans in southern states for Union supporters and freed slaves. The land was uncultivated forest, swamp, but nonetheless difficult, not impossible, for penniless former slaves to acquire for use. The next bullet, Southern bureaucrats made it difficult for Blacks to access any land, and Southern whites used violence to prevent Blacks from occupying the land. Within 6 months, the land was open to former rebels. In 1876, the law was repealed. So the much more extensive Homestead Act of 1862 granted 160 acres of government land in the West to any American who applied and worked the land for 5 years. Over the course of the next 60 years, 246 million acres of Western land, that's 10% of the area of the United States, roughly the area of California plus Texas, that had been taken from Native American, was given to individuals for free. This legislative loophole allowed 1.5 million mostly European immigrant families to come to the United States with the express purpose of settling land in the West for free. Only about 5,000 African Americans benefited. Next slide. So, keeping hope alive, and always looking for that brand new day on the horizon. Ownership, violence, and dispossession is what followed. So despite obstacles, many Black families managed to acquire farmland by World War II, World War I. There were nearly 1 million Black farms in 1920, about 1/7 of all American farms. Imagine that. 1/7 of all American farms were owned by African Americans, mostly in the South. During the 20th century, all of this land was taken or destroyed by whites. Sometimes this happened by violent mob action, as in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921, or the lesser known pogrom in Pierce City, Missouri in 1901, when an entire Black community of 300 was driven away from town. There were hundreds of these incidents of white collective violence concentrated in the South. Many thousands of lynchings were directed at Black farmers in order to terrorize all Blacks and make them leave. This violence was not limited to the South. This violence extended to New York City and the Northeast, including New Jersey. Let's talk about Billy Trueheart and Charles Lindbergh. Billy Trueheart is the ancestor of Beverly Mills, also the grandson of Friday Trueheart. Had a small cottage on Sourlands Mountain. And Charles Lindbergh, who at that moment was an American hero, later found out to be a Nazi sympathizer, a virulent racist, came knocking at his door. And he wanted Billy's 40 acres just because. And Billy said, no, thank you. And I forget the quote exactly, but I believe he said something like, to some, their land is very, very important, more important than all the money in the world. And we don't know what Charles Lindbergh said to him after that. We don't know what. However, he left his farmstead, never to return. But he never gave up heat until much later. Next slide, please. So, in addition to physical violence, there was legal trickery to dispossess Black people of their land. Vast amounts of Black property were taken by unscrupulous individuals using legal trickery, because African Americans did not trust the white-dominated legal system. They had no reason to. And they didn't understand how pass this property on to their heirs, their descendants, because typically legally they weren't the means. What happened when it came time to sell property was pretty much the bane of Black home ownership, and that is the partition sale. And from what I understand, if a group of people own land, can sort of divide and conquer and break up the land by getting individuals within the family to sell. And so the partition sale sends the property to the auction block and allows ownership to vest in the highest bidder. Partition sales are thought to be one of the primary causes for involuntary Black land loss in recent. So if your brother wanted to sell the property and you didn't, and it went up on auction because he agreed to have it sell, then you couldn't necessarily outbid the white money that came to it was a losing battle. The reason that those who can afford to purchase property on the open market are more often developers with deep pockets instead of cash poor families. Individuals purchasing air property off the auction block can pay more cash for the property, but those whose heritage is tied to the land, those are the folks who attach the deepest value to the land. Partition sales separated families from their heritage and from their home. Next. So you can hardly talk to an African American family who owned land or property and not find a story where they feel like the land or the property was taken from them against their will, illegal trickery. And this picture is from an article that appeared in the New Yorker. Next slide. With the perceived rattling of America's caste system through emancipation and various laws, granting more opportunities, the white supremacist backlash spread across the South. At the end of the 19th century, members of a movement who called themselves the Whitecaps, led by poor white farmers, accosted Black landowners at night, whipping them, threatening murder if they didn't abandon their homes. In Lincoln County, Mississippi, Whitecaps killed a man named Henry List, and more than 50 African Americans fled the town in a single day. Over 2 months in 1912, violent white mobs in Forsyth County, Georgia, drove out almost the entire Black population, more than 1,000 people. So there's this idea that most Blacks were lynched because, and this is because of the movies, probably, because they did something untoward toward a young woman. That's not true. Most Black men were lynched between 1890 and 1920 because whites wanted their land. Next slide. So, a lot changed. Talk about the Great Migration. So this is the largest mass migration in American history. Blacks now became associated with pretty cities, disassociated from nature in the popular view. The tension in American culture between Black people and anything environmental does have a basis in history. Before 1900, 90% of African Americans lived in the South. It was interesting, we have a group of founding Black families in the Sourlands Mountains that have been here since the time of transatlantic slave trade, but 90% of African Americans lived in the South, my family included, where many had been enslaved and exploited as sharecroppers in rural areas. After 2 waves of migration, when World War I and 1970, almost half of Black Americans relocated to the urban North and West. Why? Because they were fleeing domestic terrorism and seeking better lives and better economic opportunities. So Blacks set out on long distance moves to cities like New York, Cleveland, Indianapolis, Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, San Francisco, and they were often met with violence. Next slide. So Perception, reality. As African Americans move in, white urbanites began moving out. The spaces in between the city and the country, rolling green suburbs with colorful flower gardens and tree-lined streets. White Americans with the means to settle into suburbs and vacation in states and national parks seem to fit the picture of leisure time naturalists promoted by white nature writers and conservationists, described sociologist Donnetta Taylor in The Rise of the American Conservation Movement. So if you take a look at those pictures, those white folks sure look happy, don't they, among nature, right? I mean, it looks really ideal. And Black folks are relegated to tenements, crowded urban settings. Next slide, please. So the relationship between African Americans, the land stewardship is foundational and wrought with hardship and complexity. So it's true that African American attitudes toward nature were and remain conflicted. All right, so we talked about, legal trickery, manipulation, dispossession, state-sponsored domestic terrorism, massacres, institutional racism, Jim Crow, gentrification, underrepresentation, etc. Next slide, please. So what I just described is a deep but often painful connection. Next slide, please. However, the kidnapped Africans, nature was also a spiritual connection to their lost homeland and to lost gods. But even in that long, dark tunnel of suffering, African Americans recognized the capacity of nature to function as a resource that is still an ally in the fight for physical and psychological freedom. Their unique knowledge of nature and the land were instrumental in their liberation. Next slide, please. Take a look at that picture with the crocodile. As a hunted people, the ability to navigate snake and alligator-infested swamps, moss-draped forests, and rushing rivers actually sheltered their movements. They had to be really skilled and really aware of nature in order to escape, right? Navigating with the stars in the night sky to flee north is legendary. And this is, by the way, the story that I always heard. There wasn't slavery in the North because everybody was trying to get to the North because the North was free. So that's part of like the myth that I heard. But nevertheless, they had to use nature expertly in order to make their way to a better place. Perils of Black life during slavery required a hyper awareness of nature, not only as a material resource, but also as a spiritual one. However, formerly enslaved people and their descendants, the knowledge of the natural world, though once rich and bountiful, became less applicable as the expansion of farming and industrialization drastically altered the environment. Yet, when African Americans left the South en masse, they reviled the memory of the life-stealing cotton fields and Southern terrorism, but they also cherished the memory of Southern pines, meandering rivers, tropical flowers, and the delicate dishes that made from locally sourced plants and animals. Next slide, please. Out of those mixed feelings of longing and relief, migrants remembered remade connections with nature, reproducing rural lands and in miniature through gardens and chickens kept in yards. Cities all are, after all, spaces of nature, which is why collard greens from our grandmothers' urban gardens always tasted so good. The grass in these cities was not greener, it was still grass. So the writer, Margaret Walter, summoned this collective nostalgia in her poem, Southern Song. Where she says, I want my body bathed again by southern suns, my soul reclaimed again from southern land. I want to rest again in southern fields, in grass and hay and clover bloom, lay my hand again upon the clay baked by the southern sun, to touch the rain-soaked earth and smell the smell of soil. Next slide, please. So not everyone left their homes. This is my friend's son, who's a professor of Gullah and Jamaican Patois at Harvard University in the African language programs. He's part of the Gullah people, and they say that we must take care of the roots to heal the tree. This land here is my family root. To take care of it is to take care of us. Wiacha, which is their way of saying we are here. Next slide, please. So as I said, land loss equals a loss of wealth. A group of economists and statisticians recently calculated since 1910, Black families have been stripped of hundreds of billions of dollars because of lost land. Nathan Rosenberg, lawyer and researcher for the group, said, if you want to understand wealth and inequality in this country, you have to understand Black land loss. Between 1910 and 1997, African Americans lost 90% of their farmland. Next slide, please. While most of Black land loss appears on its face to have been through legal mechanisms, the tax sale, the partition sale, and the foreclosure, it mainly stems from illegal pressures, including discrimination in federal and state programs, swindles by lawyers and spectators, unlawful denials of private loans, that's a big one, and then outright violence. According to the 1920 Census of Agriculture, almost 1 million Black farmers owned 15% of American farmland. In 2017, it was estimated that the number had dwindled to about 49,000 Black farm owners. That's 0.5% of America's farmland. Next slide. This is one of my favorite slides. So, lost property isn't just money, it's also identity. It's connection to the land and stewardship of the land and connection to family. And also ownership, land ownership, home ownership leads to civic engagement. So the church that you see there is in Selma, Alabama, where my family is from. It served as a mass gathering location for religious services and meetings for the civil rights movement. In July of 1964, the Reverend Ralph Abernathy spoke to a huge gathering here in support of the Civil Rights Act. As the crowd left the church, they were attacked by members of a deputized posse under the direction of Sheriff Jim. In March of 1965, oh, by the way, I was there when that happened. I was there. I lived a block away. I was 2. In 1965, church members provided lodging and meals for activists who came to Selma to join the Selma to Montgomery March. So the house that you see in the bottom right is my grandma's house on 1303 Lawrence Street, and she actually fed and housed civil rights workers. And I can tell you this house, this little house, which seemed very large to me at the time, was pride and joy. It was really important. Next slide, please. So, talk about reclaiming the narrative. African American environmental consciousness is real, profound, and hard-won. As the sixth mass extinction unfolds around us, species by fragile species, as the rivers and seas rise above the sandbags and levees, there is no more escape to nature for the descendants of the slave or the descendants of the suburbanite. So Carol Fitting has asserted in the book Black Faces, White Spaces that the notion of Black people being aliens in the outdoors is a whitewashing of history. We should not accept this false narrative, but instead recognize the long tradition of African American environmental. And there are a lot of resources that I've included in the resource list that really provides an abundance of information about this. Today, the innovative contributions of activists like the Midwestern food scholar Monica White and the South Bronx community organizer Mahorka Carter and the Sierra Club past president Aaron Mayer carry on that tradition. Next slide. Environmental racism is the disproportionate impact of environmental hazards on people of color. Environmental justice is the movement's response to environmental racism. Yes, who the victim of America's and the world's worst environmental policies. Yep. Industrial facilities and toxic waste dumps located near communities of color, corruption of groundwater, the lack of trees in poor communities, heat map 10 degrees hotter, and income challenged neighborhoods, gentrification taxes out of existing communities, inability to have economic opportunities to improve environmental conditions. Communities of color are in double jeopardy from the climate crisis. First, if you're a person of color, particularly Black or Latino, you're more likely to live near toxic facilities like petrochemical companies here in Louisiana, producing toxins that shorten and impact quality of life. And then our communities are on the front line of impacts from climate change, living in places where there could be more floods and a higher coincidence of different diseases. For poor communities, there's also not having access to health insurance or medical services. Communities of color are disproportionately affected by all of these things, right? And so that's by Dr. Beverly White, sociologist and the CEO of Deep South Center for Environmental Justice. Next slide, please. So the disconnect. There is indeed a disconnect for people of color who are shoved to the margins of everything. Environmentalists they often believe that environmentalists were more concerned with protecting nature, as in the forests and parks they played in as middle-class white kids in the 1950s, and less so environmental justice issues. For example, industrial pollution that afflict poor, minority, and disempowered communities. The quiet and casual exclusion of Black Americans from environmental organizations and media attention, despite echo actions being led by African Americans and communities of color all over the country, needs to be addressed. The solution: alienated people of color and other disenfranchised communities are becoming more active and essential partners with mainstream environmental organizations to re-engage diverse communities. So you might ask yourself, why is recruitment of people of color important to the environmental community? Why does it matter? Because by 2050, people of color will be the majority in America. We need to make sure that this population cares for our natural places, quality of life, and our shared environment, regardless of where they live. Every land conservation organization in the nation recognizes these facts and are working to diversify the makeup of the movement that will protect our biodiversity. Across New Jersey, we have an amazing number of individuals and organizations looking after our environment and the quality of our lives, people, plants, and wildlife. This work may not stand the test of time unless we ensure that future generations care about our communities and can participate in the economy of that work. Next slide. Also, there's a new generation of leaders. Anthony Grifa Rogers Wright serves as the Director of Environmental Justice for New York Lawyers for the Public Interest. As a native to New York City, vast discrepancies his community navigated compared to the more affluent communities where his white peers lived. His childhood experiences catapulted Rogers to a career in environmental justice and its relationship to public health and human rights when it comes to access to clean air, healthy food, and more. So, what are the steps? What is it important to do? Number one, educate yourself. Number two, support good policies. Number three, vote. Vote, vote. Number four, resist the status quo. And number five, put your money and your time, because very often young people don't have money, but they do have time. Put your time and your money where your heart is. Next slide, please. So this is what empowerment looks like. Next slide. So no doubt, there are wounds left by slavery and the racist oppression that followed. Any opportunity that we have to repair the harm is worth our attention and engagement. Every day, all over our country, physical signs of African American history are being erased, repurposed, and destroyed, lost to future generations. I want you to imagine a place where African American history can be experienced, studied, honored, and safeguarded for posterity. This is our opportunity to help bring this vision to life. So thank you for listening to this presentation. Once again, my name is Donnetta Johnson. I'm the Executive Director of the Sourlands African American Museum. And we invite you into our spaces to learn about our mission, to learn how we all need to lock arms and work together to create the solutions of tomorrow. And as far as history, equity, the path forward, and our environment, our ecology, how we live on this planet together. So thank you very much. And I want to a special thanks to our friends at the Sourlands Conservancy who've invited us here, who are our partners in many things that we do. Thank you. We really appreciate this opportunity to talk to you all folks. Any questions?
Comment. Not a question, but a comment. This is information that I think we need to continue to spread the message to different communities. And my comment is that there is garden clubs currently in Mercer County, one of them West Trenton Garden Club. And to be honest with you, everyone there is Caucasian. I'm Puerto Rican, and I just joined about a year ago. Great organization, do great work, but it may be an opportunity to continue to spread this information and knowledge. So I would like to connect in that regard, because I think, like you said, it's important to educate, because not many people really know the history and a lot of the details that you've shared. Some that I didn't know, a few, but you know, so I appreciate it. A great presentation.
Thank you so much. Yeah. absolutely, please contact us.
Hi, thank you so much. I've tried several times to come to talks about the area and all the populations that are in the area and where they came from. So I'm really happy to finally get here. I just wanted to say I was down in Jekyll Island, Georgia, which has that whole section of the coast is working really hard to preserve the Gullah culture. And I recommend, because the islands are protected, they actually did a law in 1968 in Georgia that they could not be developed. People are able to live on the land and make a living. And I didn't get to witness too much of it. I was going to ride my bike, but it's just fascinating that there are people that are surviving, and it's a very dynamic culture.
Thank you for that. My friend, Son Machow, who is part of the Gullah,